Alright, so we have obviously talked a lot on this channel about the seemingly amazing ability of some of our members of Congress to beat the market when they engage in stock trading with their privileged knowledge, with their privileged information from the inside. Now, obviously, a lot of them, people like Nancy Pelosi and some other ones, will be willing to come out and openly make the argument that no, this has absolutely nothing to do with insider trading or anything like that. Of course, we know that it's entirely bullshit, and so in response to that phenomenon, we have somewhat of an unlikely duo forming here within the House of Representatives. So they say here from Axios, AOC and Matt Gaetz unite to support a ban on members of Congress from trading stocks. Okay, so kind of surprising that these two are teaming up here, but let's see if this is actually a decent bill. They say a group of bipartisan lawmakers, including some progressive Democrats and MAGA Republicans, have come together to push for a ban on members of Congress from trading stocks. They say that Representatives Brian Fitzpatrick, AOC, Matt Gaetz, and Raja Krishnamurthy from Illinois introduced the bipartisan Restoring Faith in Government Act on Tuesday, a bill that would restrict trading and ownership of financial investments by members of Congress, as well as their spouses and dependents. So honestly, I like this addition here because we've seen certain instances where a lot of them will say like, oh, I'm putting my money in a blind trust, and then it's going off to like their niece or their nephew or their son or their daughter or something like that. And it's like, we all know that you know exactly what your investments are in. You're still legislating on their behalf. I mean, one of a perfect example of this would be somebody like Joe Manchin, right? I mean, we talk about his dirty coal company, his ties to the fossil fuel industry, and he passed off one of his companies to his son. Okay, his literal son is now in charge of one of his dirty coal companies, and then he turns around and has the audacity to say like, oh, well, I'm obviously now just a completely neutral arbiter of what kinds of energy legislation that we should be pushing forward. It's like, no, it's pretty obvious that there's a direct link between your financial investments, whether they're owned directly by you or your son or some other, so-called like, blind trust or something like that. There's a perfect link between your financial investments and the way that you are legislating on behalf of the fossil fuel industry. So extending this to, spouses and dependents, I think that's absolutely a good move there. Arguably, I would say that I think members of Congress shouldn't be able to own stock point blank period, like in any way, shape, or form, whether that's in a blind trust or not, because then even knowing that you have investments within the stock market, it seems like that would lead to you to legislate based on what is in the best interest of the stock market. Now, we know, according to the data, that the vast disproportionate amount of the stock market, it's something like 10% of the country. The wealthiest people in the United States own 80-90% of the stock market. So really, when you say that you are, pushing legislation that is going to be good for the stock market, what you're really saying is you are going to be pushing legislation that is good for the wealthiest 10% within this country that own the vast majority of stocks. So I don't even think that they should be able to own stocks in any shape or form whatsoever. It's not as if they don't get a healthy salary. Okay, you don't need to go into Congress with the intention to become some sort of a millionaire or something like that. That's not how our government should work in a functioning democracy. I mean, that in and of itself seems pretty corrupting, at least in my opinion, but they give us a little bit more information here. They say it's not the first time that such a measure has been introduced. There was significant bipartisan support for the issue last year, but bills to ban or limit the issue were never brought to the floor for a vote in either chamber. They were never even brought to the floor. I mean, think about that for a second. With all of the scandals around, I remember back when I was living in Atlanta, my two home state senators, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, I think was the other one. Okay, I was about to blank on her name. They were both some of the most corrupt motherfuckers in the entire Senate, openly engaging in insider trading. That was part of the reason why we got Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff elected down in Georgia. But I mean, like, even with all of that pressure, even with all of the scandals surrounding this, okay, it's not just Republicans like Perdue and Loeffler, it's also Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, many other ones as well. With all of that pressure, we still never even got a floor vote on real legislation to ban members of Congress from trading stocks, okay, to personally benefit benefit their own financial portfolios. I mean, it's completely absurd, but that's what it looks like here in the United States when we have an open system of legalized bribery and corruption, and that's just apparently okay for some reason. And you can even get into more specifics, right? Like I've talked about on this channel before, it's not just like generic stocks and then they're doing things that are beneficial for the stock market. It's things that like the committees that these people are on are directly overseeing, okay? It was something like a majority of the people who are on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the people who are in charge of designating the Pentagon budget and where some of those investments are going to be made, they had direct investments within the military industrial complex here in the United States, whether that's Raytheon or any number of other weapons manufacturers. They have direct investments in those companies as they are also legislating as to who is going to be able to get some of those contracts, what is the budget going to look like overall. I mean, it's just brazenly corrupt, in your face. It's very obvious what is going on here. And yet we've never even gotten a floor vote on it. But they give another example here of when Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri reintroduced his bill back in January that was called the Pelosi Act. Okay, now listen, I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi, not by any stretch of the imagination. I think she is one of the most corrupt members of Congress that we have had. I absolutely despise the fact that she has been in leadership within the Democratic Party for as long as she has. Obviously, she recently passed the mantle onto Hakeem Jeffries. She's still sort of a top key power position player, sort of like behind the scenes, more so now. But I absolutely despise every single thing about Nancy Pelosi. But when you name a bill, the Pelosi Act, you are just inherently making this a partisan issue for absolutely no goddamn reason. Because again, it's not just Nancy Pelosi that's engaging in insider trading. It's Republicans, it's Democrats, it's probably some independents. It's all across the board. So if you want to tackle this in a principled issue, I wouldn't be putting forward a bill with a specific member of Congress's name on that bill. I mean, it's just like poisoning the well. And honestly, it kind of tells me that Josh Hawley, he's probably not very serious about this issue, right? Because if you were, you wouldn't put somebody's name on the bill to try to sort of, prevent that actually from going through and prevent the possibility that many Democrats would get on board with it, even some that aren't, more leftist and don't really necessarily like Nancy Pelosi. But they continue saying that after having consistently opposed such a measure, then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi signaled that she'd relent. So you guys remember that video I think I covered on this channel, months and months and months ago at this point, where she was asked about the possibility of preventing stock trades for members of Congress, and she literally, her response was to just sit there and scold the reporter and say, well, we live in a free market capitalist system, and this is just how the U.S. economy works, and members of Congress should have the ability to make those investments for themselves. And a perfect analogy for this that actually Matt Gaetz is going to bring up here in a second in one of these videos that we're going to get to is it's like allowing referees in the NBA or the NFL to bet on the games that they're refereeing in. And I mean, that's a perfect analogy because you're not engaging in free market capitalism, okay? Even assuming that we did have some form of free market capitalism here in the United States and you weren't elected, to Congress, that would be a different situation. You are members of Congress. Your entire job is to regulate politics, to regulate the economy. Of course, you are going to have privileged information. Of course, you are going to be able to make influential decisions on behalf of legislation that will benefit your own stock portfolio. We all understand that. You're not hiding anything. You're not, tricking anybody into believing that you guys are somehow like miraculously beating the stock market. And I mean, this is something that we've seen consistently for years. As pointed out here by Market Watch, just one example. They say dozens in Congress beat the stock market in 2022 despite a downturn on Wall Street. That's interesting, right? Okay, we have an economic downturn generally on Wall Street investments in people's stock portfolios. Somehow these members of Congress are just beating the market. And that must just be because they're great investors, I guess. No, it's because it's insider trading, point blank, period. Okay, so now I want to get to a little bit of this Matt Gaetz interview when he went on with, I believe, Jesse Waters and sort of discussed this alliance with AOC that he has been forming. Now he's going to throw a little dig at AOC, but let's just hear him out, see what he's got to say on this, and see if it has any actual legs to it for the near future.
Tell me the significance of you joining with AOC to get something like this done. AOC is wrong a lot. She'd probably say the same thing about me, but she's not corrupt. And I will work with anyone and everyone to ensure that Congress is not so compromised. We should disallow congressional stock trading for the same reason we don't allow the referee to bet on the game. And this is not a small amount of money. $788 million worth of securities traded by members of Congress last year. About 1 in every 4 members of Congress is doing this, and it's not exactly like I'm elected with a bunch of Gordon Geckos and Bobby Axelrods. Take Lois Frankel, who you just mentioned. Yeah. She's been a lawmaker since I was 5 years old. And I'm supposed to believe that all of a sudden she's making moves like she's Warren Buffett? This congressional stock trading has all of the fairness of like a Leah Thomas swimming competition, and I think we should put an end to it.
Okay, so obviously we're talking about Matt Gaetz here. Of course, he had to expectedly use an analogy there at the end, just throw in a little bit of transphobia because he's making an appearance on Fox News and do a dig at Leah Thomas or whatever. But just ignoring that aspect specifically at the end of that commentary there, the rest of what he had to say was not necessarily wrong. And one of the specific instances that he pointed out there was the specific member of Congress, Lois Frankel, who is a Democrat. I believe she's from Florida. And recently we had yet another massive bank collapse here in the United States. We had First Republic, we had previously obviously the SVB collapse, the Signature Bank collapse. We've had a whole bunch of different bank collapses for a multitude of different reasons, but this member of Congress, right before this First Republic Bank collapse, decided to sell her stock. Okay, obviously knowing potentially what was going to happen behind the scenes before anybody else might have. I mean, she sold it in March just before it tanked by 80%. Okay, 80%. Right? And then she apparently bought stock in JP Morgan, which is the largest bank in the United States that is going to be acquiring this failed First Republic Bank. Okay, so I mean, again, do you think that's insider trading, or is that just a miraculous coincidence, I guess, is the other side of that argument? I mean, it's just completely ridiculous how brazen they are about this. Now, on the flip side of all of that, right, we know the corruption. It's deeply baked within our Congress. Matt Gaetz understands that, apparently. AOC understands that. Bernie understands that. Lots of people are understanding that, and there is significant energy, obviously, from the American people to actually get something like this done. So here from Business Insider, they say that 70% of voters support banning lawmakers from trading stocks, and nearly half say that they're more likely to vote for candidates who support it too. Okay, so these are kind of a little bit contradictory, I guess. Like, it's slightly under half of people would say that it would impact their voting decisions based on whether or not somebody supported this ban, but 70% of them support the actual ban from lawmakers trading stocks. So, I mean, it's good that we have a vast majority of the American people who are in favor of that. Obviously, I'm in favor of that. I think that's like the bare minimum that you could possibly ask for. Is that going to address all of the underlying issues with, corruption broadly in the United States? No, we still have super PACs, we still have dark money groups, we still have lobbyists, we still have a whole host of different special interest groups that are pushing, their corrupting influence on our members of Congress. This isn't going to be a, fix to all of the different problems that we have, but this would be a good first step. And obviously the overwhelming majority of the American people support that as a good first step. So whether or not this is going to be passed, I don't know. I highly doubt it, honestly. I mean, we have a Republican-controlled House at this point. I think you could pull off some Republicans like Matt Gaetz and maybe a couple of other ones as well who sort of like break from the normal mold every once in a while. Maybe you could pull off some of them. Maybe you could even pull off some Republicans, depending, I guess, on how Josh Hawley is feeling on any given day, or I guess based on what the actual name of the bill is. Maybe name it the Pelosi Act, and then Josh Hawley will vote for it. But I have my doubts that this is going to be able to be successfully passed, but at least credit to AOC, credit a little bit to Matt Gaetz there for, actually trying to push forward with something that would lessen the burden of open and brazen corruption that we have here in the United States on our political system.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying